You're watching Reality Check. The war in Ukraine seems to have entered a new dangerous phase, with Russia switching tactics from attacking only military targets to targeting civilian areas and cities. A deadly escalation which has left one Indian student dead today. One Indian student, Naveen, killed today. Now, in its latest update, the Ukrainian government says over 360 civilians have been killed so far, including 14 children. This escalation comes at a time when questions were being raised over whether Russia overestimated the effectiveness of their own vastly superior war machine and underestimated the Ukrainian response. On paper, the Russian army is much bigger than the Ukraine army. This chart, sourced from a widely quoted database, has the matchup, and we'll go full frame on this. Active personnel, Ukraine only 200,000, Russia almost 4 times as much. Fighter aircraft, again, 10 times as much. 69 Ukraine, almost 700 plus Russia. Helicopters, again 10 times as much. 112 helicopters Ukraine, almost 1,500 Russia. Tanks, almost 6 times as much. 2,500 tanks Ukraine, over 12,000 tanks Russia. Armored vehicles, almost double. 12,000 plus Ukraine, 30,000 plus Russia. Now, despite this asymmetry, Ukraine has managed to stall a complete regime collapse of the kind Russia may have anticipated, leading perhaps to Russia's worrying new change of strategy. These tweets by the Ukraine Defense Ministry reportedly show Ukraine military success, like a Russian aircraft being shot down. Or this one, showing what appears to be drone video of a Ukrainian drone taking out Russian surface-to-air missile systems mounted on armored vehicles in the Kiev region. In fact, the Ukraine government puts out regular updates of Russian casualties. Let's go full frame on this slide. This is the most recent one, which shows close to 4,500 Russian soldiers killed, including all the other damage that Ukraine claims to have inflicted on the Russian military. Now, one of the strategies adopted by Ukraine to reduce its military disadvantage appears to be by recruiting citizens to take on the Russians in any way possible, promising to arm anyone who wants to fight. This image has gone viral. Social media is full of images like this one, where volunteers have signed up to be issued arms, like this former Ukrainian beauty queen who's posing with a military-grade weapon. In this tweet, the Ukraine Defense Ministry has even put out what appears to be instructions to citizens on how to make Molotov cocktails to take on Russian tanks. And these are other images of civilians who are taking on the Russian military, even pushing back against Russian vehicles and so on. There's also a video which shows civilians tearing cloth into strips to make camouflage nets in the town of Lviv. Listen to what this student had to say.
Today I'm just volunteer, and I take these things like everyone here. But in the future I want to take a weapon and go to protect the city.
In response, Russia, as we've said, seems to have escalated its aggression, directly targeting civilian areas. The hardest hit seems to be the major city of Kharkiv, due east of Kiev. The scale of the attack seen in multiple videos from Kharkiv.
Бегом, бегом.
And there are fears that now the capital city of Kiev could also see the same escalation, with this satellite image coming of a massive Russian convoy seen advancing towards the city. Okay, let me go straight across live to Jyoti here, who's been reporting for NDTV from Kiev. Thank you very much indeed, Jyoti, for joining us. So is this the big worry now that we're seeing, that the way the Russians have shifted focus and now targeting civilian areas, like we saw what happened with Kharkiv? Is there a worry that that could now happen in Kiev as well?
Absolutely. Just a minute ago, I received a message, like all the residents of Kyiv, from the city about the curfew and about how to tape up your windows, and we need to shut off the lights and everything residents really need to do tonight. So there is this real worry. I'm in the Kiev Central train station. There is not an inch of movement here because there are just thousands of people already here flooding in as, one train comes, fills up, goes. And they're not coming that frequently. So now it's becoming a lot tighter in here, as these are the people that were planning to stay, that were hoping that they could stay in Kiev and that the army and the armed civilians would be able to hold the Russian troops back. But as you just explained, there is that 60-kilometer long convoy headed towards this city right now. And residents are either trying to get on the trains because it's the only way out now of the city, or they are underground.
Okay. All right. Jyoti, thanks very much indeed for joining us. So worrying indications there that Kiev could now become the big next target of this escalated Russian aggression. Okay, joining us tonight also on Reality Check, we have with us, good to have him back, Sviatoslav Yurash, who's Member of Parliament from Ukraine, is with us. We also have with us Gleb Makarevich, Research Fellow, Group of South Asia and the Indian Ocean Region, Russian Academy of Science, joining us from Moscow. We have with us Major General Mick Ryan, who's retired from the Australian Army, is a leading defense analyst, and Ajay Shukla, our very own defense analyst, is here with us. So good to have you all on board. If I can just start with you, Mr. Yurash, we've been speaking to you through this conflict, and one of the extraordinary things that we've been seeing is how there's been this David versus Goliath fight that Ukraine has put up, holding off Russia's vastly superior in terms of military strength army. Many of you have taken up arms yourself. Explain to us first how that has worked. How have you managed to hold off this behemoth? And are you now worried that that's beginning to shift with Russia really ramping up the aggression?
We love our country. We want it to be independent and free, and we are willing to do anything to keep it so. We have basically shown to the world that our nation is not going to lie down and accept whatever Mr. Putin throws at us, but we shall resist with everything we can, be that babushka waving the Ukrainian flags at the armed Russian soldiers, or the villagers coming out to push out the Russian tank out of their village. We are united as never before to show the world that we don't want to be part of Mr. Putin's plan. We are our nation, and we shall decide our future. And again, Russian military casualties show very clearly that it is taking a toll on Russia. And I'm sure as days go by, Russia itself will feel the reality of the situation, because Russian mothers will start receiving their dead sons dying for a cause that they don't believe in. And the reality is, we do believe in our cause. We believe that our nation should be free, independent, and should have a future that it decides alone. And
when you see when you say that you are seeing citizens also resist the armed forces of Russia, are civilians, because many civilians have also picked up arms, the government has supplied them arms, are they actually involved in the fighting themselves? And is there a huge risk there?
Yes, they are. I mean, the point here is that even more risk is involved with Russian army taking to our streets and presenting its own version of law and order, shooting people as they have over the last couple of days, with all the kids dying, all the people dying all around. And the point is that is even greater risk. So the point is, for example, when the fighting was breaking out in north of Kiev and a column of Russian troops entered the town from the north, everybody was distributed weapons, and they basically, with enthusiasm, taken upon pushing back at the Russian incursion and destroyed it. Our point is very simple. We will not submit. We will fight, and we will win, because this is our country. We have nowhere to run, nowhere to leave. We will remain here and fight until the very end.
Okay, strong words there. But if I can just bring you in, Gleb Makarevich, is this a kind of reality which is shared in Moscow as well? Is there a view that Russia may have basically underestimated the Russian or the Ukrainian resistance, and with these reports of over 4,000 Russian soldiers being killed, is that something which is sort of hitting the current regime in Russia?
So I think that these estimates you mentioned do not correlate with the reality at all. Those losses are impossible. So moreover, what I should say is that Russia is conducting special military operations and conducting surgical strikes. Indian audience should know what surgical strikes are. And I want to say something. I want to say something to Indian audience. I know that India today suffered a loss. Bharati chatar और मुझे भारत को भारतीय समाज को और छात्र के परिवार को संवेदना लाना चाह रहा हूँ. मुझे आशा है कि शांति आएगी sooner or later.
Okay.
And
your message is received clearly, because you have a South Asia connection, you speak Hindi. But Gleb Makarevich, the fact is that when you say surgical strikes, we saw what happened today in Kharkiv. We saw the explosions. The targeting is happening in civilian areas. That's why an Indian student was also killed. So, like I said, is this a kind of frustration of Russia that militarily they're not able to advance and the regime has not collapsed as they hoped? So now civilians are being targeted?
Nope. I think otherwise. I think that Russia does not fight in its full power due to not hurt civilians. That is why.
But civilians have been killed. One of an Indian civilian has died.
Yeah. So it's my personal pity. I'm personally sorry for that. And what I want to say is that Indian students, Ukrainians themselves, should connect with Russian military officers, and they should follow humanitarian passages conducted by the Russian military and leave the cities where the war is going on, where the
that's
are going on.
That's an extraordinary thing to suggest to a nation or a country who you're invading, to say that you need to approach the other side. But anyway, I'll come back to you. Major General Mick Ryan, you've been very active on social media and otherwise as well, and there's been a lot of commentary on this, on whether Russia's military machine, though vast, is somewhat obsolete and has found itself somewhat in the woods in Ukraine. How realistic, how true is that? And are you seeing now a sort of a worrying shift as Russia now ramps up the aggression after some initial missteps?
I think it's true to say that the Russian High Command certainly underestimated the resistance that the Ukrainian military would be able to put up against it, particularly in the north and in the east. Its first few days of military operations were poorly coordinated on the ground. They did not achieve air superiority over Ukraine. Indeed, they still do not have that. They have not effectively used information operations. Indeed, the Ukrainians have been masterful all the way from their president on down. And their logistics have not appeared to be very effective at all. The Russian leaders, particularly the military ones, have obviously been told by the president, hurry up, get on with this. And that will, I believe, force them to return to more traditional approaches in Russian warfare, which involve masses of combat troops and masses of artillery, which will lead to greater destruction and certainly much, much larger civilian casualties in places like Kiev and beyond. Right.
But so far, though, explain to our viewers that how would a Ukrainian army, which is, the figures 8-10 times smaller than Russia, how have they managed to hold off? Is it that they're actually much better trained and equipped than the Russian army, or is there something else going on?
There may be some of that, but my sense is that the Ukrainians have a sense of purpose. As the first speaker said, the Ukrainians are a democracy. They believe in keeping their freedom, and Russia has nothing to offer Ukraine. And as a result of that, this sense of purpose is stealing the hearts of their soldiers and their civilians. It's not clear to me that the Russian soldiers who have invaded the Ukraine share a similar sense of purpose.
I see. So that's interesting. Purpose can sometimes even outweigh military might or conventional military might. Ajay Shukla, just to bring you in, this is kind of interesting for us in India because we are heavily dependent on Russian armaments and weaponry for our own armed forces. But this is turning out to be somewhat of a test of those armaments in the Ukraine battlefield. And Russia is not coming out looking very good, at least in this initial phase. What do you make of what is going on with Russia's strategy and military tactics, and what are the implications for us as a country heavily dependent on that same weaponry?
Srinivasan, it's actually pretty simple. The Russians have a clear-cut objective, and that is to dissuade Ukraine from joining NATO. They just want to do that with the minimum use of force. They don't want to render Ukraine a wasteland and then have to occupy a wasteland. They just want to serve a lesson to the Ukrainian leadership and to the anti-Russian public as a whole that you will not be a member of NATO and allow NATO to come up to your border. So the exercise of dissuading them is now underway, and Russia wants to do that with the minimum use of force. The minimum use of force, unfortunately, has not proved to be enough, and Russia is now having to calibrate upwards to get in more forces, get in more troops, and sort of get on with the job and finish it off once for all. That has not happened at all according to Russian calculations, and therefore you're finding civilians getting killed, visuals of bombs taking out buildings and so on.
Right.
The Russian army can put away the Ukrainian army anytime they like with no problem at all. The problem is that would involve concentrating a large number of forces.
Right.
These figures that we have on the screen, 10 times as many tanks and so on.
Right.
Those tanks are not available entirely for use against Ukraine.
Sure.
That sort of tends to portray a false impression of sort of Russia being held back by a David and Goliath scheme. In actual point of fact, I suspect that Russia will achieve its objectives, and then Ukraine will then be sort of the stranglehold would be loosened. Okay,
but that's the whole point here, Gleb, that is not clear in terms of the objectives. As Ajay said, if the idea was simply not to have a wasteland or a devastation, just to dissuade Ukraine from joining NATO, then why are we seeing what we're seeing, which is very much that kind of extreme reaction where buildings in civilian parts of cities are being blown up, civilians are being killed? This seems like a very different objective.
So I think that the objective is the same. Objective is to get the Ukrainian elites to negotiate, and that is why I would like to solidarize with Shuklaji. Because I think that Russian army does not fight in its full force, so it's not to target civilians, or it's not to in order to prevent civilian losses. And it's a great pity that sometimes, due to the ongoing hostilities, civilians die.
But if you say the idea was for negotiations, Gleb Makarevich, I mean, while negotiations were going on, yesterday at the border with Belarus, bombs were landing in civilian areas in Kharkiv. So I mean, how can Russia keep saying that they're not interested in escalating aggression, they're interested in diplomacy and talks, when they're staging attacks during talks?
So Russia have been holding negotiations for 8 years and got no answer. Today, we are having negotiations and simultaneously we have hostilities. Unfortunately, the point is that the only way to get current Ukrainian elites negotiations is to conduct special military operation.
Okay.
And
yes.
Our hope is that no more civilians. Personally, I hope for that.
Okay, you hope for that. Okay, General Mick Ryan, realistically though, what do you see as the end game here? That if the Ukrainians continue to resist in whatever scrappy way that they are, through a combination of their conventional forces, even civilians coming out, how is this going to end? It doesn't seem to be ending very well.
Well, even if the Russians are able to achieve tactical victory, it will be at the cost of many, many lives of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. And while there may eventually be some form of tactical victory, politically, I can't see this as a victory for Putin. He has now a country of 44 million Ukrainians who hate him, and any Russian influence over Ukraine will have to be at the end of the barrel of a gun. That is not a successful political outcome.
Okay, but do you see, when you say that a political outcome, do you think that the outcome and the way that it's going will lead to a regime collapse in Ukraine? Is that where we're heading, where the current premier, Zelensky, will either be deposed or killed, and there'll be some sort of a Russian puppet or a proxy installed, and that's how the NATO membership will get blocked?
I think that's far from assured at the moment. I think the Ukrainians have put up a very stiff fight, and they're winning the war of opinion, and they've rapidly mobilised global opinion and global support in their favour. But if the worst was to happen and the Ukrainian government was to collapse in front of massive Russian military might, I think the Ukrainians would engage in an insurgency for many years. They've done so before in their history. They've been good at it. And I think they would get a lot of support from the outside world in that, and they would slowly bleed Russia white.
Right. But Ajay, when you said that Russia will achieve its objective, if the idea is to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, it's actually seeming to be the reverse at the moment, because literally today, as the Russian tanks continue to roll in, bombs continue to fall, you had President Zelensky actually sign, the first step of NATO membership, sign a form. He's actually trying to hasten his entry into NATO.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think Putin has ensured...
General, that was for Ajay Shukla. Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. Yes, Ajay, go ahead.
Yes, you're right. If you're saying that the Ukrainians are sort of tending to posture that they're joining NATO, in fact, I have not seen any huge appetite within NATO itself to draw Ukraine into their fold, because they will then become responsible under Article 7 of the NATO treaty for the defense of NATO against Russia. And that is a sort of escalatory step that NATO does not want to take.
Right.
But, the bottom line was that the whole Russian plan was predicated on them giving a few light blows to the Ukrainian army,
and
the
they kind
Ukrainian
of roll
army
over.
folding over
Yes.
and this thing. That has not happened, and that is making things very difficult for Russia.
Okay. Last word from you, General Ryan. You said that the Russian army doesn't seem to have the same appetite as the Ukrainians do. There's not that sense of purpose. If the war continues to not go according to plan, because at the moment Putin seems to have an uncontrolled sort of hold over all spheres of Russian decision making, but if things start to unravel, is there a challenge possibly from either within the army or within his circle of advisors and so on, who may put up their hands and say, listen, maybe we need to rethink this?
I think President Putin needs to be more scared of the Russian people, who so far have not been kept well informed by the Russian government of what's going on. Once they do find out more details about what's been happening in their name, we may see even greater protests and greater pressure on President Putin to withdraw his troops and chart a different path in how he relates with the rest of the world.
Gleb, I don't know if I have time, but if I do, just a quick question to you, where you said that the Ukrainian figure for the Russian casualties, Ukraine has put it to over 4,000 dead. You said that these are imaginary or these are not accurate figures. What is the official Russian death count of how many soldiers, Russian soldiers, have died?
So, according to official Russian counts, there are not even dozens of soldiers and some.
Sorry, how many?
Not less than a dozen, as far as I remember.
Less than 1,000.
Less than a dozen.
Oh, less than
Less
a dozen.
than-
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Dozen. And a number of vehicles.
Oh
No,
my
less
God.
than
Okay,
a
that's an
dozen.
extraordinary discrepancy. So the Ukrainians are saying almost 5,000 now. Look at that latest count. And you're saying the Russian figure is less than a dozen. Well, that
Yeah.
also gives you a sense of how multiple wars are often fought, of information wars as well as wars on the battlefield. But we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all so much, gentlemen, for joining me on Reality Check. Thank you for watching. Good night.